as you see, we are dealing with the 7 churches of Revelation. And of course, the first letter that was written in chapter 2 of Revelation, the first letter was written to the local church, which was at Ephesus. Now, of course, if you want to learn more about the church at Ephesus, you can go to a passage like Acts chapter 18, verse 18, all the way through chapter 19 to verse 41. But for time's sake, we're not going to do that because, of course, that would take a good bit, and there's an awful lot to go through there. But as we're going to see in this series of presentations, we will seek to briefly examine the geographical, historical, and archaeological context relating to the cities where each of the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation was located. And so, of course, you see in the map over here, this is, of course, a map of what is most of modern day Turkey, or what would have been known as Anatolia or Asia. Now, specifically, the Roman province of Asia, where the 7 churches are located, is over here on the western part of modern day Turkey. And of course, we're going to be dealing with Ephesus first. Then we'll go to Smyrna, then Pergamum, then Sardis and Philadelphia, and then Laodicea. So we'll get through those over the next few weeks. So, now, when we read our Bibles, oftentimes we forget that each of the letters or books or Gospels were written to specific people in a specific place at a specific time for specific reasons. And we shouldn't be surprised that each of the cities where the 7 churches were located had different locations. They were in different places. Each had a unique history that helped to influence the scriptures that were written to them. And each has unique archaeology that backs up what the Bible teaches. And I believe gives us a glimpse into what life was like in Bible times. Because, you know, yes, there are things that we have in common with those people, and we have in common with all people throughout the world, but they're 2,000 years removed in a different part of the world with different cultures, different religions, different ways of thinking, different building styles. There's a list of differences. And, you know, being so far removed, we often just assume that sort of everything was just like how it is today. But it was not. We have to understand they were different. We are different to what they were like, and so on. Now there's commonalities. But as we see some pictures here, of course, that we're going to become knowledgeable with over the next few weeks. But we start off with Ephesus. So we deal with the geography of Ephesus. So where was the city of Ephesus? There, where the big yellow and red circle is. Now, you know, we may think oh, well, obviously it's there. But if I were to ask you on a blank map where the city of Ephesus roughly was, would you be able to point out before you saw this? Shame. No. But the fact of the matter is, most people wouldn't know. They just know it's there, but they wouldn't have a clue where it is. But it's good to know where these places are, and it's going to be important here in a moment, as we're going to see. But the city of Ephesus, or the modern day, well, it's near the modern day town of Selçuk, that's a Turkish town, along with the other 6 cities, was located in what was known as the Roman province of Asia, so modern day Western Turkey, in what was known as also as Anatolia. So Anatolia is often more an older name for what would be known as Asia or Turkey today, or Asia Minor. So there's multiple different names for the same place. But when the Bible is talking about Asia, specifically it is talking about the Roman province. How do we know that? Well, because all of the 7 churches were located in the Roman province of Asia. So it can just mean Western Turkey. It can mean the entire region. And then in some cases it can even mean further afield. But the context tells you in the Bible what it is talking about. So, when the Apostle John wrote down the Revelation and sent it to the 7 churches of Asia Minor in circa 95 AD, he had been banished by the Roman government to the small island of Patmos. Now, that would be even harder to point out if you didn't know, but Patmos is here. So here is Ephesus, there is Patmos. It's about 40, 50 miles to the south west of Ephesus. And so he'd been sent there for preaching the gospel and for teaching the Bible. And so I also want to point out something here too, is that you notice here that the cities of Revelation, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, what you notice in these cities is it's sort of clockwise. So it was sent here. Now we don't know the exact way how the scriptures were transmitted at this point. Did John write down 7 copies of Revelation, or have 7 copies written down and send one, each of them separately? Or did he write one to Ephesus, they read it out, they copied it, and then sent it to Smyrna, who did the same thing over and over again, until finally it got to Laodicea, until finally it got into our hands today? The Bible doesn't tell us, so we make some assumptions there. But the fact of the matter is, it has got into our hands, one way or another. So the island of Patmos. So he had been exiled there. Now, here's a picture of Patmos. Now, Patmos was not an uninhabited island, so John wasn't just there by himself. Well, because he would have had to been girded. Because if an adventurous Christian had decided, oh, well, I'm going to go and rescue John from his island exile, they could have just got on a ship or a boat and said, okay, out we go, pick you up, John, off we go back to the mainland. No, there were people living on Patmos. Not a lot. It wasn't the hub of civilization. Presumably John would have been girded, otherwise what good would the exile have been if someone in a boat came along and just rescued him and brought him back? But Patmos was a backwater. It wasn't really important. It was just a good place to send someone who had become inconvenient. So the island of Patmos. And there's even a site there which tradition states is where John received his the revelation. Is that the place? Well, possibly. We do not know. We know where the island is, but the exact spot is up for debate. Now, as regards Ephesus, now, I don't know about you, but when I first read the Bible, I had in my mind an idea of what these places ought to look like. Until you finally go there and you realize, no, that's not what the places look like at all. Yeah. And the thing is, Ephesus, as you can see here, this picture is taken by me. Sorry if it's a bit dark here, but it was one of the few times it got cloudy in Turkey. But here, this is looking towards the ancient site of Ephesus. So Ephesus would have been nestled just over here. So you can sort of just see it in the picture there, to the right centre. You can actually just about see the Roman theatre there in the centre. And the main part of the city would have gone down here. Now, interesting note, this part that we would have been that I was standing on at one point would have actually been water. It used to be a bay until it got silted up. Now, this is the topmost part of the city. So, we were looking up there and you see there's a valley. Well, this is, if you look down to the left, down to the side of the hill, you would look towards where I would have been standing where I took that picture. So, this is the top part. Now, here is a reconstruction of what Ephesus would have probably looked like in ancient times. So it just gives you an idea of what the city was like. It was one, as we're going to see, one of the largest ancient cities in the Roman Empire. And you can see the theatre. Of course, there was the Temple of Artemis or Diana. And you see many different forums and different marketplaces. The city was massive. And as would have been recognizable in the ancient world, there was the port. Now we're going to talk about that here in a moment. But this just gives you an idea as to what the city was like. Now, Ephesus was one of the chief port cities of Asia Minor and was located on the river Cayster by the hills of Coressus and Pion and Aal-Soluk. Over its long history, though, Ephesus, due to constant silting, moved further and further away from the Aegean coast. Now, dredging was attempted and for a while helped to prevent this. But in about 1244 AD, the port was finally abandoned. It is now 8 kilometers inland. So you see the picture there on your right. You notice here, the dark areas, that was what the coast was like in its Ionian settlement period. Now, the city apparently even existed in some form, in some way, shape or form, all the way back to the Hittite period. But you go there now and you think, oh, look, it's in the middle, it's landlocked, you know, it's in the middle of this plain. Well, that plain used to be a bay. And so over time, however, the coast, due to silting, got pushed back and back and back and back. And finally, one of the great port cities in the Roman world had to be abandoned. And in fact, you notice here in this picture, this is just in front of where the theatre is in Ephesus. And this used to be the road that once led to the harbour, where ships used to come in and of course, dock, and they used to go and, of course, take on travellers or remove their goods or so on and so forth. Now you just go down to the end of it and, well, there's just land there. But this used to lead directly to the harbour in Ephesus. And of course you can see it would have been highly decorative in its time, but of course it's only the ruins that we see today. Now this is a site close by to Ephesus, but this gives you an idea of what the plain in front of Ephesus is like. But imagine all of these fertile fields at one point were underwater. Now, why is this plain so fertile? Well, because it used to be underwater. But now it's completely landlocked. It's miles away from the coast. The coast is all the way off in the distance. But you imagine at one point ships, even in Paul's time, could sail down to the harbour of Ephesus, which would be just to the left of this photo. So things change. So that's not what Paul would have seen in his day. It would have been different. That's what happens over a few thousand years of history. Things do not always stay the same, even in geography. So, not only though did the city move further away from the sea, it also changed its location at least 3 times by the time of the New Testament. Now, the idea of cities moving to us today is sort of weird and crazy, but cities did move for multiple different reasons. And apparently it moved at least 3 times. Well, not huge distances, but a fair way from where it originally was. Now, the city that we know of, and what was known in Paul's day, was relocated by Lysimachus, a successor to Alexander the Great, in about 294 BC, between the hills of Croesus and Pion. This is where the city was located in the New Testament era. So you see where that red arrow is? That shows us where the city was. So this gives us an idea of how things were in Paul's day and in the New Testament period. So no wonder it was a harbour town. No wonder it was a port city, because it was right beside the sea. Now you cannot do that. Though interesting note, the Turkish government are planning on actually creating a canal from the coast all the way into Ephesus, so tourists can be bought up boats from the coast to the site of Ephesus. Apparently, that's they're planning to do that. Whether they will do it or not, that's a whole nother thing. But a lot of people go to Ephesus. It's one of those places in Turkey where if you see a tourist website or a tourist brochure, you'll probably look at Ephesus and you'll see sites from there. And you'll probably recognize one here in a few moments. So, that's the geography. So you have an idea of where it is and how it came to be in the place it was. Now, there's an awful lot more information, but we can't go into all of that. But this gives us at least an idea of what was going on. Now we're going to deal with the history of Ephesus. Now, the city by the New Testament era had been ruled and influenced by many different people. For instance, the Ionians had ruled over the region in around circa 1000 BC. Then the Lydians in the 6th century BC. The Persians then ruled from 546 to 333 BC. Then the Greeks ruled from 334 to 128 BC. And then the Romans came then in 129 plus. So the fact of the matter is, we see here that the city of Ephesus had many different people controlling it. So Ephesus was a cosmopolitan city. It had many different religions, had many different cultures, it had many different peoples mixing in it, which isn't surprising for a big city. And in fact, you notice here, this picture on the right, this is showing you the road that goes up between those two hills. So behind you, where I've taken this picture, that's where the famous library is. So this is looking up the hill. Now, of course, this is just the famous bit, but around it would have been houses and different buildings. Now, this picture here is looking down towards the hill, towards the famous library of Celsus, where the harbour would have been over down further. Now, by the 1st century AD, Ephesus was the 4th largest city in the Roman Empire, after Rome, Alexandria in Egypt, and Antioch on the Orontes. Now, in the 1st century AD, it replaced Pergamum as the Roman provincial capital. So Pergamum up until that point had been the place where the Roman governors had dwelt and where Roman administration was administrated over the province of Asia. However, Ephesus then received that. Now, inscriptions refer to it as the first and greatest metropolis of Asia. So it was the great city in Asia. It was in fact one of the greatest cities in the entire Roman Empire, and one of the biggest. And in fact, here we just show you some pictures. Here we see a picture of the Bouleuterion, or the council chamber, and the political agora or forum in the background. Now, you may say that looks like a theatre. Well, yes, it sort of is, but it's where you could say the political theatre went on. So this wasn't where plays were enacted or entertainment was given, unless you like politics. This is where, of course, the council of the city would meet to discuss matters. Why is it designed that way? Well, you know, if a theatre is a good place to act and to sing and to entertain where everyone can see you and hear you, why don't you use the same design for a council chamber? Everyone can see you, everyone can hear you, and the speakers can be noticed. It's a good design. If it works for entertainment, it works for politics too. And of course, in the background was where more business would have been done politically. So what do I mean by political agora or forum? Agora is the Greek term, forum is the Roman term. But it's just basically a meeting place. So this is where the politics, the business of the city would have taken place. The market, or you could say the commercial agora or forum, was down towards the theatre, so at the bottom end of the city. So you'd have to walk up the hill to get to the political centre, or you'd have to go down the hill to get to the business centre. Now, if you're ever going to see a picture of Turkey, or you go onto Turkish websites, or, you know, tourist websites about visiting Turkey, you've probably seen this building. What is it? Well, it's the famous Library of Celsus. Now, let me say, this building, the facade of it, because actually it isn't very big when you actually go and see it, but it looks monumental, and it is monumental. This library was not actually built till after the time of Paul and John. It was built in the late first, or earliest late first, very late first, or early 2nd century AD. And it was named after a man called Celsus. His son had it built for him, in honour of him. So the Library of Celsus. Now you look at it and you think, wow, it must be a big, massive building. Actually, it's not. You notice in the picture there, you can see a brick and stone wall at the back. That's how deep it was. So it's not. But it was 3 stories. And so, you know, it's, of course, they didn't store books as we have them today. They stored scrolls. And so there's been speculation as to how many scrolls or documents this library could have contained. Well, it's been estimated that probably about 12,000 books or scrolls could have been stored in these 3 floors. So you can see them more close. So you see, it's not a very far back building, but the monumentalness of it is magnificent. You go up there, and it's just one of those places you look at and you can't be helped but being a bit blown away by it to some degree. So, the Library of Celsus, which wouldn't have been there in Paul's day, and it probably wasn't there when John was there either. So the Library of Celsus. Very busy place, always crowded with people. But you remember that street I showed you? Well, that was lined with different monuments too. Here we see the remains of a fountain that was dedicated to the Roman Emperor Trajan. Trajan, of course, ruled over the Roman Empire in the early part of the second century AD. So after the time of John and Paul. But what's left of a monumental fountain to the Emperor Trajan. There's also remains and temples to the Emperor Domitian and so on, and Vespasian and other Roman emperors and many different gods. However, Ephesus being one of the largest and most important cities in the ancient world and in the Roman Empire, how do we know it was wealthy? Well, besides the fact it had all these big temples and it had this library and all these arches and a big harbour and lots of houses. Well, amazingly, when they were excavating in Ephesus, and they're still excavating there, and they will be probably excavating in Ephesus for centuries to come. You know, you think, wow, they found everything. No. And in fact, probably some of the coolest stuff is under all of the Roman and Greek stuff. Yeah. As one archaeologist once said, it's just a pity that all that Greek and Roman junk is on top of the important stuff. And it is. Ephesus was inhabited for centuries before the Greeks or the Romans ever came along. What could be under the ground that we don't know of, that we'll never get to see because the marble looks much nicer? And it does, in honesty, it does. But we do know and have evidence of the wealth of the Roman city. How do we know that? Well, when they were digging on the side of the hill, so if you're looking up the hill from where I took that picture, if you look to the right, there's this structure. What is it? It looks like a big shed. But, well, it's there for a reason. Because when archaeologists started excavating on this side of the hill, they found the remains of surviving Roman terrace housing. Now, you may say, what? Sort of like cheap old structures? In fact, you go in there, and I'll show you some pictures of what it's like, how big it is. But you go in there, and this is like a maze. Literally, you walk through it on these platforms, going through these different structures. It's hard to know where one house ends and another house begins. They really did live pretty close together. However, you go through it and you see that as they were digging, they found, notice these frescoes? Frescoes are what? Are clay that has been painted on, so it absorbs the paint. They see frescoes. You can see the vivid colours. You can see, of course, all the garlands painted on the frescoes. You can see what appears to be masks, because when, of course, they were acting in the ancient world, they'd wear masks. So they didn't generally act without them. But this is just looking up, so you can get an impression of just how close these buildings were. Notice here the mosaic on the ground with the lion. You see more frescoes with birds. You can see the bright colours, the redness. This was all underground for centuries. It just happened to survive. So you can see the platforms that go through this. This is looking across. So you see more mosaics, more frescoes. So you see just how far this goes back. And this is only part of the city. So here's yet more. Now you wonder, well, why is it all twisty and turny and it looks like it's all bumpy? Well, it's because it's been under the ground for centuries. But yet it has survived remarkably well. And that's why they had to put the big shelter over it to make sure it doesn't get wet. Because if it got wet, it would be ruined after a time. And so you see more pictures just going through. See, it's very hard to figure out where one structure ends and another begins. So you see even the different paints, the different Roman styles of art and painting, interior. And you see even more. So you see even up close. Then you see over here some examples of Roman plumbing, indoor plumbing. Now, of course, not everyone in the Roman world had all these things. You know, there were the rich and there were the poor and there was the middle class. But the fact is, this shows that Ephesus was a wealthy city. And this is looking down. So you're at the top of that big shed-like structure, looking down towards the bottom of it. And these are all buildings, residential structures. So if you like privacy in a Roman city, you probably didn't get much privacy. Or you had to have big gates and doors to make sure you didn't get people in who you didn't want in at certain times. But anyway, the Jewish historian, we move on, Josephus, though, wrote in his work against Apion that Ephesus had a large Jewish population, which extraordinarily had been granted full rights by both the successors of Alexander the Great and the Romans. Now that's significant. Why so? How so? Because this Jewish presence is also confirmed in the book of Acts, chapter 19, verses 1 to 8. Where it states there was a synagogue there and Paul preached to the Jews in the city. Now, they haven't found a synagogue in a city, but in a city like that, you probably might never find it. But there could have been multiple synagogues in a big city of thousands upon thousands of people. However, they have found oil lamps and other artifacts that are related to the Jews based on what imagery is on them, which could only clearly be Jewish. But of interest to know is on the steps of the Library of Celsus, just of course down there, you can just make out on the left hand side, it's a bit faint, but do you notice what has been chiseled onto the steps, the marble of the Library of Celsus? It's a menorah. So obviously there was some Jews sitting there probably bored and thought, I want to leave my American, let everyone know I'm a Jew, and there's Jews around here, because the Romans wouldn't have done that, the Greeks wouldn't have done that. It was just a bored Jew who was probably sitting there, I think I'm going to put a menorah there to put my mark on it and say my Jewishness. Graffiti in the Roman world is very common. In fact, they used to chisel board games onto steps like that, and so they play board games on the steps. Many different things. And of course, lewd or crude remarks or political sloganeering or whatever. That was just normal. Now, the city, though, was famous for its magical spells and practices. Now, we'll see this in a moment, but in particular, there was documents known as the Ephesian letters, which were particularly well known. Written down magical spells that were used to ward off evil spirits and grant good fortune. So, you know, if you wanted a magical spell that was written down that was considered the best, the creme de la creme of magical spells, you would get an Ephesian letter. Now, it just had, we don't know exactly what was on them, but it was believed that if you had this set of nearly impronounceable words and you were able to pronounce them successfully, that would keep demons away. That would grant health in pregnancy. That would give you good fortune. It's sort of like the equivalent of the word abracadabra. That was considered a magical word. That's why you say like, abracadabra. You know, and you know, we don't mean that if you're doing it. If you said that, you're using a magical spell. But that was a magical word. And certain words had certain power. Now, of course, we don't believe that. However, these practices are clearly seen in Acts 19:19, when many newly saved Christians destroyed rather than sell their expensive magical books, which were worth a fortune. So this was the city was a hotbed for magic and the occult and mysticism. Not surprisingly, as it is associated, we're going to see, with the goddess Artemis or Diana. But the newly saved Christians, they destroyed all their magic spells, and there was probably a good few of the Ephesian letters in there, and probably sent some people in the crowd mad, said, "You're burning your Ephesian letters, well, why don't you give them to me instead?" No, they burned them. So we don't know what exactly. The Bible doesn't go into details, but it was worth a fortune, which showed there was great business in it. Now, besides being the capital of the Roman province, Ephesus was also the capital of the worship of the goddess Artemis or Diana. Now, Artemis is just a Greek name for the huntress goddess, and Diana is just a Roman name. There's no difference. They're just two different names for the same goddess. Now, you can see on the right here, there's a depiction of the Sibyl, who most believe is an earlier depiction, or at least related to Artemis and Diana. And then you see in the middle the Ephesian Artemis, which is a lot different to the Roman depiction of Diana or Artemis. So these two represent the same goddess. It's just one is Greek and one is Roman. And even the Ephesian Artemis is considered very strange compared to other Greek Artemises. Why? Because, well, she had been there so long worshipped in Ephesus that the Greeks just accepted it as that. Though if you notice depictions of Artemis in other Greek art, she doesn't look like that. But they're the same goddess. Now, this area had long been associated with with goddess worship, the Sibyl, seemingly before the arrival of the Greeks. And in fact, later on, you know what the Romans did? They took a stone that was believed to have been connected to the goddess Sibyl from Ephesus in Asia, and they brought it back to Rome. So they transplanted the Sibyl. Literally. Lock, stock and barrel. Oh, here's this stone that came down from Sibyl. I'm bringing it over to Italy now. So, however, this city was also the centre of the worship of other gods, including the Roman emperors. That was the 1st century. Every ancient city or even town would worship a god or multiple gods, depending on who. And many cities like Ephesus had their patron god or goddess. For instance, you go for Ephesus, here is a depiction of the winged goddess Nike. Now Nike, you must say, Nike, I remember that, I've got Nikes on my feet. Well, yeah, why do they call shoes Nike? Because Nike is the goddess of victory. And, you know, basically what they're saying, implying is, no one, of course, understands this, but what they're saying is, I'm wearing the shoes that are going to give me victory. Now, most people don't know that. Nike's just a pair of shoes. So don't think, someone's wearing Nikes. Oh, pagan. They don't know. But throughout our culture, we are festooned and littered with Greek and Roman religious, cultural, historical references that most people haven't got a clue about. It filters through all Western society. Why? Because European American history is heavily influenced by the Greek and Roman worlds. That is how it is. So Nike. There's also, of course, Hercules or Heracles. Heracles is the Greek name for Hercules, which is the Latin name. And of course, it's a bit hard to see in this picture, but you can see he's wrapped around with his lion skin pelt. It's a bit hard to see, but it is there. He was strongly associated with the slaying of the Nemean lion, Hercules. There's temples to the Emperor Domitian, which you can see here on your left, and then the Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century AD. So this city was dedicated to the worship of many gods. Now, the most important temple and the most major was to the goddess Artemis, Diana. Now, the first major temple to the goddess in the area was built in the 8th century BC. The next was built by the Lydian king Croesus, who of course is famous for his great wealth, in the 6th century BC. This temple was called the Artemisian. And apparently, as far as we know, you take this with a pinch of salt, was destroyed on July the 21st, 356 BC, when it was burnt down by a guy called Herostratus, who wished to become immortal. And so Herostratus was really annoyed. He probably thought, I'm never going to be remembered. I want to be remembered for something, but I failed so fair. So I need a bright idea that's going to get me remembered for all eternity. Oh, wait there. I'll just burn down that big old temple to Artemis over there, and then everyone will remember who I am. Well, yeah, he was remembered because after the town lynched him and killed him, they banned his name from ever being used in the city for a name of their child. So he was remembered. Now, that means, guys, you don't necessarily go out and burn down the building and say, I'm going to be remembered forever and ever. It is a way to be remembered, though. It's a bit odd, but apparently that's what happened. Now, what's even stranger, and we take this with a large pinch of salt, was this was seemingly the same day that Alexander the Great was born, which he saw as a sign and tried to aid in the rebuilding of this famous structure. In fact, it was claimed that Artemis couldn't come and save the temple because she was so busy watching Alexander being born. Oh, I was so busy. Alexander's being born. My temple in Ephesus burnt down. Alexander comes in after he liberates the Greeks of the region, and he offers to give them money and stuff. And you know what the people say? They say, no, it's all right, we'll rebuild it ourselves. Because they realize, well, if we let him get any sort of foot in the door of building that temple, we'll never hear the end of it. And he'll have influence. So they said, no, we'll rebuild it. And they did. Now, the new temple was built and finished in 236 BC and was the largest temple in the Greek world. Now, here's a reconstruction model of it down below. It was about 4 times the size of the Parthenon in Athens. Now, you go to the Parthenon in Athens, you'd be, whoa, that's huge. This was 4 times the size of it. So that was piddly compared to the Temple of Artemis. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Of course, the only one that survives today, of course, is the pyramids of Giza, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, or Cheops. The ancient Greek writers Antipater and Pausanias wrote about this structure. Now, here's 2 lengthy quotes, but I may as well tell you, they're bragging on it. It says, I have set eyes on the wall of lofty Babylon, on which is a road for chariots, and the statue of Zeus by the Alpheus, and the hanging gardens, and the colossus of the sun, and the huge labour of the high pyramids, and the vast tomb of Mausolus. But when I saw the house of Artemis that mounted to the clouds, those other marvels lost their brilliancy. And I said, lo, apart from Olympus, the sun never looked on anything so grand. So Antipater was quite impressed, if he saw all the rest of them too. Though I think the pyramid is cooler, it would have been cooler in honesty, but hey. Then there's Pausanias. He writes, but all cities worship Artemis of Ephesus, and individuals hold her in honour above all the gods. The reason, in my view, is the renown of the Amazons, who traditionally dedicated the image, also the extreme antiquity of the sanctuary. 3 other points as well have contributed to her renown. The size of the temple, surpassing all buildings among men, the eminence of the city of the Ephesians, and the renown of the goddess who dwells there. So in other words, Antipater and Pausanias were very impressed with what they saw, and they remark how remarkable this structure was. Now we're going to see what it looks like today in a few moments. Now we must also remember that temples were not just religious buildings, they were political and economic structures. It also served political and economic purposes. The temple was also used as a place for asylum seekers. Cleopatra's teenage sister, Arsinoe, was murdered here in 41 BC while in asylum. She was murdered by Mark Antony and Cleopatra while she was meant to be there under the protection of Artemis, but they had her murdered because, of course, Cleopatra did not want Arsinoe alive as a possible threat to her throne. This outraged a lot of people. You just didn't do that sort of thing. And also it was a storehouse for treasures. The special relationship, both financially and religiously, between Ephesus and the worship of Artemis was well known and is clearly seen in Acts 19:23-41. Remember, what is the riot all about in Acts at Ephesus? It started off because the preaching of Paul and the Christians in the city had cut into the business of the little silver shrines that were being made in honor of Artemis. So they're not just worried about the goddess not being worshipped, but their pockets are being hit because people went there. It's like if you go to Lourdes or Medjugorje today, it's not just the religious sanctuaries that you go there and you basically get your religious souvenirs and gifts. The same was true there. And so when the riot starts out, it's over 2 things, religion and money. Now, primarily it was about money, but the religion would have come into it too. You just didn't do that sort of thing. Now, here we see a picture of the Grand Theatre, where the rioters congregated against Paul's teachings. Now, remember, the Bible says that the riot starts off, and they take 2 Christians and bring them into the theatre at Ephesus. Now, notice there in that picture, up you see where the trees are, just to your left there? That's where the marketplace was. So probably the rioters and the silversmiths who started the riot had their businesses probably just over there. Because where do you think they'd be selling their little souvenirs or making them? In the marketplace. So they start the riot, they grab the two Christians, they bring them into the theatre, and what does Paul say? He wants to go in, but the guy said, look, if you go in there, you're dead meat. Don't you be a fool. And they stop him from going in. And then, of course, the leader of the city says, look, calm down, lads. If they hear we're having a riot here on the provincial capital of Asia, the Roman government's going to be furious. Go home, lads. Settle down. And they do. And Paul's told to get out of town as quick as possible because they don't want him around anymore. But this is the theatre. So Paul would have been hanging around outside wanting to get in. And, of course, the two Christians trying to speak were being shouted down by the crowd saying, great is the goddess Diana, 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 great is the goddess Diana! So if you want to quote scripture, you can also quote that. I've got a verse. Of course. But the fact of the matter is, this is where it took place. Now, here we see, this is the theatre, that's the harbour road where the harbour used to be at the end. So you notice there, the market's just over to the left. And here's another picture. Now, the theatre in Paul's day wouldn't have been that big. It was expanded upon. You can see the top bit was added on, but it was still big in Paul's day. It could have held thousands and thousands of people. And so this is the road leading down to the harbour. So, you know, there are some places in the world you can go to and you can point and say, Paul stood here. Peter stood here. Jesus stood here. So-and-so stood there. You know, which is exciting. Which is all the reason you go and see these places if you can. Now, getting back onto this, what happened to the Temple of Artemis? Well, the temple stood and was operational until 262 AD, when it was destroyed by the Goths, the barbarians from Eastern Central Europe who came in, invaded through Greece, got into Asia, and destroyed Ephesus. Now, with the rise of Christianity, though, the temple was never rebuilt. So this is before, of course, Constantine the Great, when Christianity was made the state religion of the Roman Empire. And so when that arose, they're like, well, why rebuild it? Because, well, we don't worship those gods or goddesses anymore. And they wouldn't have rebuilt it before that, probably because they were struggling to find money or resources to do it. It's a big job. How could you do it unless you have time and money? Now, over time, it was looted for its materials. Hey, this is free stone. And there's a lot of it. And it's being worked. Let's take it, guys. No one else is using it. Diana don't want it no more. She's gone. Now there is little left to give an impression of what the temple looked like in its full glory. And you see these pictures here? That's what's left. It's one of the most underwhelming sights of the seven wonders of the ancient world you'll ever get to see. And some of them, we're not even sure where they are. But two pillars, and you notice up there, there's a heron's nest. It's a bird sanctuary now, well, sarcastically, but there's a nest. You see the little bird up there? Yeah, it's right up there. I think there's its partner coming over. That is the Temple of Artemis today. Gone. Little to nothing left of it. However, there is some of it left in different places, because some of what remains of the temple can be seen in the British Museum and at the Hagia Sophia, or the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. You go to the British Museum, they have this bottom of one of the columns that came from the Temple of Artemis. And it just gives you an impression, this was just the bottom foot of a column that held up the structure of the temple. So you imagine what the rest of the structure was like. And this would have been, like we look at these classical sculptures, think, oh, look at the marble, isn't it fantastic and clean? That would have been very gaudily painted. Bright colours, very bright colours. But over here, here's the Hagia Sophia, or the Blue Mosque. See these columns here? Those were robbed later on by the Byzantines from Ephesus and bought to be put into the Hagia Sophia because if I remember correctly, within the Hagia Sophia structure, there's some columns from Egypt, some from different parts of the Byzantine Empire. And of course, Ephesus was one of them. It's a statement of, we can afford this, we control all of these things. Also, finally, tradition teaches the Apostle John lived in Ephesus later in his life. It is also believed that John died and was buried in Ephesus sometime after he wrote Revelation, which we'd see no reason why to disagree with that. Like I said, if tradition doesn't contradict the Bible, we're all right with it. We don't accept it necessarily, but we at least can say, well, that's a possibility. If it goes against the Bible, well then, Bible wins over tradition. Top trumps every time. But here was a basilica church that was built over the site where John was believed to have been buried. Now, the picture on the right is apparently, by tradition, the place where he was first buried, but then they built a bigger basilica. So they literally, it's like, they decided, okay, let's build a bigger church over where John was buried, and let's move his body a little bit. And in fact, interesting note, you go into there and they have a baptismal pool, which you have to go down into to be baptized by immersion. So, even there you go. So, now that's a lot to go through. There's plenty more I could mention, but this is all the relevant things I think we need to know. But in conclusion, by the New Testament era, Ephesus had become one of the chief cities in Asia Minor, or Asia. This importance was based upon its location, its political power, its commerce, and its being the center of Diana or Artemis worship in the ancient world. And so, with that, we learn a little bit about the context of Ephesus. Now, of course, next week we're going to go through the letter that was written to the local church that was at Ephesus. But we'll deal with that next time. So we're going to finish there.